The city of Seoul didn't look like a home from the back of a fantastical, bulletproof Maybach. It looked like a circuit board of cold light and electricity, humming with a power that could consume anyone who touched it. June sat in the rear leather seat, a phantom in a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most families earned in a decade. He was 31 years old, the newly solidified head of the Cheonyong syndicate, and terrifyingly handsome in a way that made people stop breathing when he entered a room. He possessed everything a man was supposed to want: the loyalty of 3,000 soldiers, the fear of the government, and a bank account that grew by the second. Yet, his eyes were fixed on something that didn't belong in this world of polished chrome and blood money. In his hand, resting against the knee of his trousers, was a cheap, yellowed paper napkin. It had been folded and unfolded so many times over the last 5 years that the creases were beginning to tear, holding on by mere fibers of memory. It wasn't a contract or a hit list. It was a receipt for a bowl of beef stew, date-stamped 5 years ago, with a smiley face drawn in blue ballpoint ink on the back. His lieutenant, a sharp-jawed man named Min-suk, cleared his throat from the front seat, glancing nervously at June through the rear-view mirror. "Sir, the board meeting is in 20 minutes. The regional captains are waiting to pledge their fealty." June didn't look up. His thumb traced the fading ink of the smiley face. "Cancel it," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet cabin. "Tell them to wait. If they leave, kill them. But I have somewhere else to be tonight." Min-suk blinked, clearly confused but too disciplined to argue. "Somewhere else, sir? The sector is unstable. Where are we going?" June finally looked up, staring out at the rain-streaked window, watching the neon signs blur into streaks of red and blue. He wasn't seeing the luxury district they were driving through. He was seeing a dirty alleyway 5 miles and a lifetime away. "Take me to the old district," June commanded, tucking the napkin into his breast pocket over his heart. "Take me to Esme's kitchen. It's time to pay the bill." The memory hit him harder than the rain that had been falling that night 5 years ago. He hadn't been the dragon of Seoul then. He had been garbage. He had been 26, a mid-level enforcer who had made the fatal mistake of showing mercy to a rival's child during a raid. The syndicate hadn't just fired him, they had dismantled him. They had broken 3 of his ribs, fractured his orbital bone, and stripped him of his coat, his wallet, and his dignity, dumping him in the labyrinth of alleyways behind the commercial district to die of exposure or shame. He remembered the taste of mud and iron in his mouth, the freezing water soaking into his torn shirt, and the certainty that he was going to expire next to a dumpster filled with rotting cabbage. He had dragged himself toward a sliver of warmth, a yellow light spilling out from the back door of a small, struggling diner. He collapsed against the brick wall, his vision tunneling, waiting for the end. That was when the door opened. He flinched, expecting a boot to the ribs or a final bullet. Instead, he heard a gasp, followed by the soft scuff of sneakers on wet pavement. "Oh my God," a voice said. It wasn't Korean. It was accented, warm, and frantic. Through his one swollen eye, he saw her. She was a vision of contrast against the gray misery of the alley, a beautiful African woman, no older than 25, wearing a pristine white shirt and a bright red vest that looked like a heartbeat in the dark. She didn't scream for the police. She didn't recoil in disgust at the blood matting his hair. Esme dropped the trash bag she was holding and knelt directly in the mud beside him. "Hey, look at me," she urged, her hands hovering over his injuries, afraid to cause more pain. "Can you hear me?" "You're freezing," June tried to growl, tried to tell her he was dangerous, that touching him was a death sentence, but all that came out was a ragged cough. She didn't listen to his weakness. She hooked her arms under his shoulders, surprisingly strong for her slender frame. "Come on," she whispered, straining as she pulled him up. "I'm not leaving you out here like trash. Come on, soldier. Up you go." The diner was closed, the chairs already stacked upside down on the tables like a forest of wooden legs. The air inside smelled of roasted garlic, degreaser, and safety. Esme sat him down in the booth furthest from the window, away from prying eyes. She moved with a rhythmic efficiency, bringing a first aid kit and a basin of warm water before she even asked for his name. June sat there, shivering uncontrollably, watching her. She was undeniably beautiful, with skin that glowed under the warm pendant lights and braids pulled back into a practical bun, but it was her eyes that disarmed him. They held a deep, ancient kind of empathy that terrified him more than a knife. "This is going to sting," she said softly, dabbing an antiseptic cloth against a cut on his cheekbone. He hissed, his hand instinctively shooting out to grab her wrist. It was a threatening reflex, a soldier's instinct. Esme didn't pull away. She just looked at his hand gripping her wrist, then up at his eyes. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "The world has been unkind to you today. But in here, you're just a guest." June slowly released her, his breathing ragged. "Why?" he rasped, his voice sounding like broken glass. "I have no money." I'm nobody now." She didn't answer immediately. She finished cleaning his wounds and then vanished into the kitchen. Minutes later, she returned with a steaming bowl of spicy beef stew and a mound of white rice. She placed it in front of him with a plastic spoon. "Eat," she commanded gently. "When my father died, he told me that nobody makes good decisions on an empty stomach." June ate like a starving animal, the heat of the broth bringing feeling back to his numb limbs. When he was finished, he looked at her. She was wiping the counter, humming to herself, acting as if harboring a beaten gangster was a normal Tuesday. He stood up, swaying slightly. "I have to go," he said. "If they find me here, they burn this place." Esme walked him to the back door. The rain had stopped. He turned to her, grabbing a napkin from the dispenser and clutching it. "I don't have anything to give you," he said, the shame burning his throat. "But I'm going to take this city back. And when I do, when I have everything," he looked her dead in the eye, making the only vow that mattered. "I'll come back. I'll marry you when I'm rich. That's a promise." 5 years was a long time to live on a promise that felt like a hallucination. For Esme, the years had been a slow, grinding war against gravity. The diner, Esme's kitchen, was her father's legacy, but legacy didn't pay the rising rent or bribe the health inspectors who suddenly found imaginary violations. She sat behind the counter, staring at the empty tables. The red vest she wore was the same one from that night, though the fabric was thinning at the elbows and the color had faded after hundreds of washes. It was a Tuesday night, raining again, and she had served 3 customers all day. The ledger in front of her was a sea of red ink. "You have to sell, Esme," Chloe said, leaning against the doorframe. Chloe was her best friend, a pragmatic woman who worked at the pharmacy across the street and viewed hope as a dangerous drug. "The developers are offering a buyout. It's barely enough to cover your debts, but it's an exit. If you wait, the Northern Syndicate is just going to take it." Esme closed the ledger with a heavy thud. "I can't, Chloe." "This is my home," Chloe sighed, walking over to put a hand on Esme's shoulder. "He's not coming back, you know. The guy from the alley? It's been 5 years, yes. He was probably high or concussed. Men say whatever they need to say to survive the night. You're waiting for a ghost." Esme looked out the window at the slick black asphalt. She kept the memory of him tucked away in the back of her mind, the intensity of his eyes, the way his hand had trembled when he made that ridiculous, theatrical promise. "I'll marry you when I'm rich." It was absurd. It was a line from a bad movie. But it was also the only time in 5 years she had felt seen by someone who understood what it meant to be broken. "I'm not waiting for him," Esme lied, her voice quiet. "I'm just not ready to let go of what I built." But as she spoke, the bell above the door chimed, not with a customer, but with the heavy, aggressive entrance of 3 men wearing leather jackets with the insignia of the Northern Syndicate. The air in the diner instantly turned cold. The leader of the thugs was a man named Calm, a thick-necked brute who enjoyed the sound of his own voice almost as much as the sound of breaking glass. He didn't sit down. He walked straight to the table nearest the window and swept the salt and pepper shakers onto the floor with a casual backhand. The glass shattered, loud and sharp in the quiet room. Esme flinched but stood her ground behind the counter. "I told you yesterday," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I'm not selling. And I'm not paying protection money for a neighborhood you don't even own." Kong laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "We own the air you breathe, sweetheart," he sneered, stepping closer. "You think because you're a foreigner you get a pass? Tonight isn't a negotiation. You sign the deed transfer, or we burn this place down with you inside it." He slammed a crumpled document onto the counter. Esme looked at Chloe, who was shrinking back against the wall, terrified. Esme reached under the counter, her hand brushing against the panic button, but she knew the police wouldn't come in time. "Get out," Esme whispered. Kong leaned over the counter, grabbing the lapel of her red vest. Wrong answer. Suddenly, the street outside exploded with light. High-intensity xenon beams cut through the rain, flooding the diner with a blinding white glare. The low hum of heavy engines vibrated the floorboards. Kong froze, squinting at the window. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. Outside, 4 black SUVs had boxed in the entrance. The doors opened in perfect synchronization. 12 men in matching charcoal suits stepped out, forming a corridor to the diner door. They didn't look like street thugs. They looked like a Praetorian guard. The door to the diner opened, and the bell chimed, a delicate, innocent sound against the suffocating tension. A man stepped in. He was wearing a suit that cost more than the entire building. He didn't look at Kong. He didn't look at the shattered glass. He walked straight to the counter, his eyes locking onto the woman in the red vest. June had returned. Kong released Esme's vest as if the fabric had suddenly turned into molten lead. The air in the diner, previously thick with the smell of stale coffee and fear, was now suffocatingly thin, sucked dry by the presence of the man standing in the doorway. June didn't shout. He didn't puff out his chest or posture like the street thugs who were currently freezing in their tracks. He simply walked forward, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the linoleum floor, the sound of a judge's gavel striking the wood. He stopped 3 feet from Kong, his hands loosely clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable, carved from marble. "You have 3 seconds to remove your hand from her space," June said, his voice a low, terrifying baritone that didn't just reach the ears, but vibrated in the ribcage. 1. Kong blinked, his bravado crumbling like wet chalk. He knew this face. Everyone in the underworld knew this face. This was the Dragon of Soul, the man who had unified the fracturing clans in a single night of negotiation and bloodshed. Mr. Kwan, Kong stammered, stepping back so quickly he tripped over his own feet, crashing into a table. We didn't know. This is your territory?" "We didn't know." June ignored him entirely, his gaze shifting past the thugs to Esme. He looked at the red vest, the fear in her eyes, and the way her hands were trembling. A flicker of pure, unadulterated rage passed through his eyes, not at her, but at the world that dared to threaten the only person who had ever shown him kindness without a price tag. "Min-suk," June said softly, not looking back at the door. Min-suk materialized from the rain, followed by 4 other men who moved with the silent lethality of shadows. "Escort these gentlemen out," June commanded, his eyes still locked on Esme. "Explain to them the new borders of the district. Make sure the lesson sticks." As Kong and his men were dragged out into the rainy night, protesting, begging, then silenced by the heavy thud of car doors, June finally moved closer to the counter. The violence outside was business. What happened inside was personal. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a pristine white handkerchief. He reached across the counter, not to grab her, but to gently wipe a speck of dust from her shoulder where Kong had touched her. "I apologize for the noise," June said, his voice dropping to a tender register that shocked Chloe, who was still pressed against the wall. "I tried to get here sooner." The diner fell into a profound silence, the kind that usually follows a thunderclap. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, rhythmic wiping of windshield wipers from the convoy outside. Esme stood paralyzed behind the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the man in front of her. The bruises were gone. The torn clothes were replaced by Italian wool. The desperation was replaced by absolute authority. But the eyes, dark, intense, and filled with a terrifying amount of hope, were exactly the same. "You," she breathed, the word barely audible. "You're alive." June offered a faint, almost shy smile, a crack in his armor that he allowed only her to see. "I told you," he said simply. "I keep my promises." He reached into his breast pocket, over his heart, and withdrew the object he had guarded more fiercely than his empire. He placed the yellowed, fragile napkin on the counter between them. The blue ballpoint smiley face stared up at them, a childish drawing that carried the weight of a lifetime. 1 bowl of spicy beef stew. June read the receipt aloud, his voice thick with emotion. Paid for with kindness. Debt outstanding. Everything else, he looked up at her, and for the first time, the powerful mafia boss looked vulnerable, like a man offering his neck to the blade. I didn't forget, Esme. Not for a single day. The cold nights, the wars, the empty boardrooms. This napkin was the only thing that felt real. Esme slowly reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the paper. It was warm from his body heat. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. You came back, she whispered, as if she still couldn't process the reality of it. You actually came back. June reached across the counter, his hand hovering for a moment before covering hers. His skin was rough, calloused from years of fighting, but his touch was agonizingly gentle. I told you I'd marry you when I was rich, he said, the words heavy with intent. I have the money now. I have the power. But none of it means anything if you're still terrified in a diner that's falling apart. I didn't come back to buy you, Esme. I came back to ask if you'd let me serve you for a change. Chloe, watching from the corner, finally exhaled, her cynicism shattering in the face of a devotion that defied all logic. Leaving the diner felt like stepping out of a black and white film into Technicolor. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, fracturing the city lights into diamonds on the asphalt. June didn't let his men open the car door for her. He did it himself, shielding her head with his hand as she slid into the leather interior of the Maybach. It smelled of cedar and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the grease and bleach scent she had lived in for 5 years. As the convoy began to move, gliding silently through the streets, Esme felt a wave of vertigo. Where are we going? She asked, looking at June. He was sitting close to her, his posture relaxed for the first time in years. Home, June said, and then corrected himself. Well, my house. It doesn't become a home until you're there. He took her hand, interlacing their fingers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through him, grounding him. I know this is overwhelming, he continued, his thumbs stroking her knuckles. I know I'm a stranger with a familiar face, but I want to show you who I became. And I want you to know why I became him. He turned to face her fully, ignoring the passing cityscape. Do you remember what you said to me that night? When you cleaned the blood off my face. Esme shook her head, mesmerized by the intensity of his gaze. I said a lot of things. Mostly trying to keep you awake, June smiled. You said, you're worth saving. No one had ever told me that. My father sold me to the syndicate when I was 12. The bosses used me as a weapon. You were the first person to see a human being. He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a reverence reserved for religious artifacts. I spent 5 years building a fortress, so that no one could ever hurt you. I bought the block your diner is on this morning. Not to tear it down, he assured her quickly, seeing her eyes widen. To protect it. It's yours. Forever.
No rente, no landlords, no tugs.
It's a monument to the night my life actually started. The penthouse overlooked the entire city of Seoul, a glass box in the sky that felt separated from the gritty reality below. But June didn't bring her there to impress her with the view. He led her to a wide oak table covered in blueprints and documents. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a builder. Look, he said, pointing to the plans. This is the foundation we're starting next month. An orphanage and a vocational school in the old district. Free meals, safe beds. He looked at her, seeking her approval more desperately than he had ever sought a business deal. I have blood on my hands, Esme. I can't wash it off. But I can use these hands to build something that protects people like us, people who are thrown away. Esme traced the lines on the blueprint. She saw the vision. It wasn't just guilt money, it was systemic change. She looked up at him, seeing the boy from the alley hidden inside the suit of a king. You did this? She asked. Because of a bowl of stew? June shook his head, stepping closer, closing the distance between them until they were sharing the same breath. Because of the woman who gave it to me, he reached up, cupping her face in his hands. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with 5 years of waiting. I don't want to just be your savior, Esme. That's a temporary job. I want to be your partner. I want to wake up every day and try to be the man you saw in the alley. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers for permission. When she didn't pull away, but instead leaned into his touch, he kissed her. It wasn't a demanding kiss or a hungry one. It was soft, slow, and devastatingly tender. It tasted of rain and relief. It was a seal on a promise made in the dark, finally brought into the light. For Esme, the fear of the last few years evaporated, replaced by the terrifying, wonderful realization that she was loved, not for what she could give, but for who she was. "I'm not easy to live with," she whispered against his lips, laughing through tears.
I'm stubborn.
"And I'm keeping my job," June laughed, a genuine, deep sound that filled the empty penthouse. "I'm counting on it." The food at home has been terrible. 10 months later, the sign above the diner had been repainted, the neon crisp and bright. Esme's kitchen inside. The lunch rush was chaotic, loud, and joyful. But in the back booth, the one permanently reserved with a small brass plaque, sat a man in a charcoal suit, feeding a spoonful of mashed potatoes to a toddler who was giggling uncontrollably. June looked different. The hard lines of stress around his eyes had softened. He wasn't just the dragon of soul anymore. He was a husband. Esme walked out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her wedding band catching the light. She didn't wear the red vest anymore. She wore a dress of her own choosing, though she still insisted on working the floor. She slid into the booth next to him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "He refuses to eat the carrots," June reported seriously, as if discussing a tactical failure. "He takes after his father," Esme teased, kissing June's cheek. On the wall above their booth, framed in museum-quality glass, hung a cheap, yellowed napkin with a blue, smiley face. It was the most valuable thing in a room that now hosted politicians and CEOs who came to pay respects to the couple that ran the city's largest charitable foundation. They didn't just donate money. They changed laws, protected the vulnerable, and turned the underworld into a machine for the community. The camera lingers on that framed napkin, then slowly pulls back, out through the window, rising above the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. The city is still cold, still hard, but there are pockets of warmth now, spreading like lanterns in the dark. It reminds us that power isn't just about what you can take, it's about what you can give. We often think that love is about grand gestures and diamond rings, but sometimes the entire trajectory of a life is changed by a single bowl of soup and the courage to care for a stranger. What small act of kindness are you withholding that could change someone's world? The story of June and Esme isn't just a romance, it's a challenge.
Go out.
Be the person who stops in the alley. You never know who you might be saving.